Why are startups so interesting? Why are we still doing this podcast after more than 250 episodes? Why is Paul Graham so fascinating? It's because so many of the things that make startups great are counterintuitive. They don't just go against your intuitions, they go against, quite often, human nature.
I'm not here to preserve the OKR, I'm here to move the needle for the business. But Chris, the OKR is this and then the number is this, and I finally blurted out, I don't give a shit about the numbers.
And that's why you no longer work at Uber.
And that's why I no longer work at Uber.
You're listening to the Startup Podcast. This is an educational episode.
Hi, I'm Yaniv Bernstein.
And I'm Chris Saad.
And in today's episode of the Startup Podcast, we are sharing some of the best wisdom from one of the absolute legends of Silicon Valley. We are talking about Paul Graham, founder of Y Combinator, essayist extraordinaire, I would say the living embodiment of the Silicon Valley tech startup ethos. He is amazing, and today we're going to go through some of his most incredible wisdom. Stay tuned, and we'll get into it right after the break. Listen up, I know a lot of you use dev agencies to help build your product. Problem is, a lot of those agencies suck. I've been looking for one I can really endorse, and I finally found one. Warp Development are the powerhouse behind countless successful startups and enterprises for over 22 years. They have 100+ experts who don't just code, they solve business problems. From custom software to AI consulting, Warp delivers results that move your business forward. And they're in your time zone. They have offices in Australia, the United States, and South Africa, so you get local support with global expertise. Are you ready to build something that matters? Visit warpdevelopment.com, that's WARP development.com, and mention the Startup Podcast for a free consultation. Today's episode of the Startup Podcast is brought to you by .tech domains. One thing about starting your startup that should be easy but isn't is naming it. Why is it so hard? Because all the good .com domain names are taken. So you end up doing something silly like misspelling it or adding random prefixes or suffixes. No more. Your domain shows your focus and intent, so you should make it sharp, clean, and unmistakably tech with a .tech domain. Head to get.tech/TSP or a registrar like GoDaddy to grab your .tech domain today. That's www.get.tech/TSP for the Startup Podcast. Okay, welcome back. Now, for those of you who thought that Paul was actually going to join us on the podcast, I'm sorry to disappoint you. He actually said at the last moment that he couldn't, but that's all right because we have got his essay from 2009, but this is timeless, right? It is called Startups in 13 Sentences. And to us, Chris, this is like one of the best distillations of what makes a Silicon Valley style startup so different and so counterintuitive that it is worth, for example, shooting more than 250 episodes of a startup podcast just to get the subtleties and the nuances into everybody's heads. So he's written down 13 of these timeless principles. We're going to go through them one by one, break them down, provide some of our own analysis and color. So the first one is pick good co-founders. PG writes, co-founders are for a startup what location is for real estate. You can change anything about a house except where it is. In a startup, you can change your idea easily, but changing your co-founders is hard, very hard. And the success of a startup is almost always a function of its founders. Now, Chris, here in Australia, actually, sometimes you can move the house. You have trucks with a giant house on the back of them, but honestly, it ain't pretty, so you don't want to do that. Let's talk about what this one means.
Yeah, I was just talking to an investor actually about this just before this recording, and I was saying when you're doing early stage investing, basically the only thing you're investing in is the founders. And if you're starting a company, the first, best, most important decision you can make is who your co-founder is going to be. There's a saying when you are a director of a film, which is half of directing is casting. It's just like half of managing a startup is choosing the people, the cast of characters in your company. It is a cliche. Your people are your most important thing, but it is true. And it is even more true in startups where your impact is outsized and where the journey is so difficult. It's so emotionally difficult. It's so tactically difficult. It's so strategically difficult. You need really, really high quality people who are in it for the right reasons, who are willing to be resilient and focused and dedicated. And it's just the whole game, you know, is are you going to win or lose in the early days, and sometimes in the later stages too, based on who you have as your wingman or woman.
That's absolutely true. And there's a certain truism there where it's like, okay, investors invest in founding teams. As a founder, that investment, the equivalent of that is in finding your co-founder. So you want to find a good co-founder. But there's something that I've realized going through my own journeys here, which is that these founders are not just independent units. You don't just say, oh, okay, I've got co-founder 1 is good and co-founder 2 is also good, so it's a good team. No, you're investing in the team. And the team is, of course, a non-linear system. A good team is more than the sum of its parts, and a bad team is less than the sum of its parts. So when you are a founder and you're thinking about picking good co-founders, you need to think about what is a good co-founder relative to you. So it is really important to think, are their skill sets matching and complementary? Do you want the same things in the ways that matter? And also maybe, are you happy to share the things that can't be shared? And also, Chris, is your relationship going to last? Are things going to go okay when you are feeling the heat? Because the one thing that's guaranteed in a startup is things are not always going to be going well. When the chips are down and things are not going so well, is your co-founder going to stand by you? Is your relationship going to survive? Or is the whole thing going to fall apart? Because, I think it's true, and the stats that bear this out, one of the most common causes of startup failure is founder breakup. And once you're in the system and you start getting to know startups and getting to know founders, you realize that these breakups are incredibly common. In fact, most startups lose a founder along the way. And so if you can create a founding team that is truly resilient and cohesive and complementary, and so every person is top-notch on their own, but the team is even more top-notch, then you are really in an incredibly strong place. And so that, to me, is what pick strong co-founders means.
Yeah, I'd say most startups fail because of the founders, one way or another. Paul Graham here writes, it's easy to change your idea, but changing your co-founders is really, really hard. So yeah, truer words were never spoken. All right, the next one is launch fast. Paul Graham writes, your reason to launch fast is not so much that it's critical to get your product to market early, but that you haven't really started working on it until you've launched. Launching teaches you what you should have been building. Till you know that, you're wasting your time. So the main value of whatever you launch is that you are able to engage your users. We've talked about this a lot. Minimum viable products, minimum viable iterations, ship, learn, iterate. And the famous saying is everyone's got a plan until they get punched in the face. Another one I like to say is everything you do is academic until real users are using it. And so Paul Graham is saying, it's not just about creating value early. It's not just about being first to market. It's not just about all that stuff. It's about actually learning what users do with the thing you're shipping. Does anyone give a shit? Does it create any real value? If not, why not? How do you change it? How do you adapt it? What have you learned? The faster you put it out there and the faster you ship changes, the faster you will learn and grow.
Chris, I'm raising a pre-seed round at the moment, and I was lamenting, as is tradition before we started recording, some of the challenging conversations I've had with investors about this sort of stuff. And the conversations are often around, well, I can't quite tell exactly what your product's going to be, and you should share your roadmap with me and so on. It doesn't make sense, because the honest answer when you are raising pre-seed, when you're in really early stages, I don't really know what the product is going to be, because what I need to do is build a version of it, ship it, see how the market responds, and then just keep on iterating. So the question you should be asking is, how are you going to get to market quickly, and how are you going to iterate quickly? And by the way, some of the fantastic investors who have signed on to be part of the Violet journey already have been pushing us on just this point. They ask us just one question: how are you going to move quickly? Because these are folks who understand how Silicon Valley style startups are built. And Paul Graham always articulates it so well as a reason why he's the godfather of all this. This is the core Silicon Valley principle, is that you let go of that false precision, that sense of being in control of, like, if I just think hard enough, if I just sit in my ivory tower and do enough research and build enough models in Excel, I will be in control. And you say, no, I abandon myself to the winds, right? I abandon myself to the currents. The ocean is stronger than me, and I am going to work with it. I'm going to engage. I'm going to jump into that water and see where it takes me, rather than trying to pretend that I am the master of this whole thing. And there's something really profound about it.
Yeah. So many people come from academic worlds, or come from agency worlds where they have one big deliverable, or they come from waterfall enterprise worlds where they just have to go away and get it right the first time, or their boss will fire them. Or they come from, high school and college where you have one chance to hand in your essay, and it has to be exactly right. It's like startups don't work that way. They ship, learn, iterate, and repeat.
Point 3 from Paul Graham: let your idea evolve. This is the second half of launching fast. Launch fast and iterate. It's a big mistake to treat a startup as if it were merely a matter of implementing some brilliant initial idea. As in an essay, most of the ideas appear in the implementing.
Yeah, so we touched on this one in the last point, of course, but what we want to add here is this phrase that's quite popular and quite well known, which is fall in love with the problem, not the solution. So people often will imagine like, well, I want to help people get from A to B. And what I've imagined is a Ferrari, and I'm going to build a Ferrari and it's going to be amazing. But really what most people want most of the time is a Corolla or even a scooter. And if depending on which segment and which distance and where, what problem you're solving within that A to B problem, they might need an airplane or a jet or a prop engine. So you need to be obsessed with the problem, getting from A to B, but adaptable as to how you deliver the solution and adaptable to how your solution evolves over time as the maturity of your product evolves, as the maturity of the market evolves, as your budget evolves, as your capital availability evolves, and so on. So you need to evolve it based on the learnings we talked about in the last point, but you need to evolve it based on just the vector of time and the vector of market dynamics and then the vector of your roadmap.
So another saying that springs to mind, this is not from the essay, but I think it relates, is the idea of strong opinions loosely held, right? Which is that any point in time, you should have a really strong idea of what it is that you're building, right? Because frankly, and this is something I experience every day, is if you don't believe that what you're building is the right thing to build based on what you know, there are too many ways to get blown off course and you just never end up really building and shipping it. But as soon as it meets the market, you listen to the market, and the market is probably going to tell you your opinions were wrong, right? So you better hold on to them loosely. If you're like, oh, sure, I hear you, market, but what you don't understand is I have a 3-year roadmap. I told my investors about that 3-year roadmap. It's amazing, and I'm just going to stay the course. Well, you're an idiot, right? Because you need to be able to change your opinion. You need to have that suppleness, right, to let your idea evolve. And by the way, I think it's interesting, Chris, Paul Graham used the word evolve. He didn't say, this is about evolution and not revolution. So again, you're not throwing everything out and starting again each time you go to market and your product idea fails. No, but you are updating your priors. You're saying, my opinions were wrong because now I've learned new information. I'm going to update my opinions. My ideas are going to evolve. And I think that's really powerful. It's a big misunderstanding often of pivots and the lean startup and this way of thinking. It's not that you throw everything out and start again each time. It's this process of iterative refinement. And fundamentally, Chris, we talk about this, about learning. This is about learning. The only way you learn is by having your product out in the market and then listening to what the market has to say.
His fourth bullet here in this essay is understand your users. He writes, you can envision the wealth created by a startup as a rectangle, where one side is the number of users and the other side is how much you improve their lives. The second dimension is the one you have most control over. And indeed, the growth in the first will be driven by how well you do in the second. As in science, the hard part is not answering questions, but asking them. The hard part is seeing something new that users lack. The better you understand them, the better the odds of doing that. That's why so many successful startups make something the founders needed.
What this is saying, I don't know why PG went with this whole complicated rectangle thing. What he's saying is, don't focus on growth in user numbers, focus on making a product that people really love. And the only way you can do that is by really understanding people. You're not going to accidentally stumble your way into a product that people love. It comes from that nuance and from that understanding. And that the pathway to growing your user numbers is through building something that people love, which is a very Paul Graham statement, of course, delivering them enormous value. And you do that by listening to them, by understanding them, by having empathy, by understanding something new about the world, which is the exact shape of a problem that people have that you can then fit a really amazing solution into. And once you do that, that is how you lead yourself to growth. If you focus on growth first, rather than value delivery, rather than understanding your users, that's like a sugar high, right? It's not that hard to grow, but it's hard to sustain the growth. It's hard to capture value when you're not delivering that much. And so the first thing you must do, understand your users and deliver them an enormous amount of value.
This one really hits close to home. I meet so many founders in my advisory work where they're trying to grow. You said growing is easy, but understanding users is hard. I would quibble with that slightly. What is it you're growing against if you don't have a product that solves a problem for people? It's sort of like trying to run, not before you walk. It's like trying to run before you have legs, right? It doesn't make any sense. The thing you're trying to grow is a product. A product is something that performs some utility for a user. If you do not understand the user, you cannot understand their problem. If you don't understand their problem, you can't build utility. If you don't have utility, you can't have growth. You can throw a bunch of people at it through ads, and they'll like kick around and look around for a half a second and leave. But that doesn't drive growth. It just drives like transient nonsense, right? You must understand your users, understand their pain, and build something of value before you fast forward to growth, and then before you fast forward to monetization. I can't tell you the number of founders and startups I meet are like, Chris, we need to turn on a subscription revenue model. I'm like, fantastic. What monthly value do you create for users? And they're like, what do you mean? What monthly value? We were thinking of just maybe they could sign up to a discussion forum or something. I'm like, what are you talking about? Stop it. Understand your users, solve their problems. Everything else is downstream of that.
But I think it is worth understanding, Chris, why this is so hard to fight against, because the metrics around growth are more appealing and easier to articulate than the metrics around user value, right? If you say, hey, we've got 20% more users than we did last month and the month before and the month before, even if it's artificial, right? To your point, even if you've just been spending it on ads or something like that, that's a really clear story you can tell your investors, you can tell yourself. Whereas if you say, hey, our product was 20% more useful than it was last month, but we still only have 5 users, that seems like you're still playing small. And I think that, again, why are startups so interesting? Why are we still doing this podcast after more than 250 episodes? Why is Paul Graham so fascinating? It's because so many of the things that make startups great are counterintuitive. They don't just go against your intuitions, they go against established orthodoxies, and they go against, quite often, human nature. And I think this is a really important one here, right? Where you're like, okay, we want to be big, we want to have impact in the world, but it's like, no, walk before you can run. And walking here is delivering immense amounts of value to even a small number of users.
They also tend to go against every other kind of business, right? Large
Yep.
businesses, agencies, small businesses. Startups are generally the opposite of all of those other things, and those things tend to be in the water. They're the things you watch your mum and your dad create, right? Their little small business. They're the things you went to school and you studied the industrial model of developing value in essays and assignments. And you worked in a big business and you studied their bureaucracy. Very few people actually lived in the agile organism known as a startup. And so their intuition, both from human nature and from lived experience and the culture, is completely wrong. Completely wrong.
That's right. It's a business, but it's not a business. And that goes back to our very first episode, Chris, more than 250 episodes ago. Small business syndrome. Okay, let's get on to number 5. Better to make a few users love you a lot than a lot ambivalent. Ideally, you want to make large numbers of users love you, but you can't expect to hit that right away. Initially, you have to choose between satisfying all the needs of a subset of potential users or satisfying a subset of the needs of all potential users. Take the first. It's easier to expand user-wise and satisfaction-wise. And perhaps more importantly, it's harder to lie to yourself. If you think you're 85% of the way to a great product, how do you know it's not 70% or 10%? Whereas it's easy to know how many users you have. Well, Chris, this is really similar to the last one, isn't it? It's about saying, you don't just want to sort of peanut butter yourself across a large number of users and convince yourself that it's okay because they're all kind of getting a certain amount of value out of what you're doing. If you don't solve some people's pain 100%, you really haven't gotten that far.
Well, the last one is you have to understand your users. This one is you need to narrow the set of users that you involve yourself with. So if you understand or try to understand all the users, let's say we build a great product for women, okay? You're not going to build a great product for women. There are too many different kinds of women with too many different parts of the world who have too many different problems. You must narrow to an insanely narrow degree, right? Like 18 to 25-year-old women in the US, in California, who are affluent, who are looking for better running shoes, who like to go jogging every morning, right? Like you need to narrow it right down until you're like feeling so uncomfortable and embarrassed. Like, oh my God, how can we possibly make a business out of this? And then it's what Peter Thiel calls becoming a monopoly in a niche. Okay. You want to make those women in California who run every morning such huge fans of your running shoes that they're going to tell all the other women in their niche, and then they're going to start to tell other women, well, the cool women are using these sneakers, you better buy them too, even if you don't go running every morning. And then eventually you can introduce the other line for the women who go walking every morning, and the other line who those who only come, only want to be, posers. And then you do the other line that's the luxury version. And then you can expand the minimum viable problem, the minimum viable set of users, after you've become a monopoly in one of those niches. The alternative is you make a generic shoe like all the other shoes, and no one gives a shit. It solves no one's problem at all. And so there's only one choice here, as he says, find your niche and pay close attention to them. All right. The next point that he has in his 13 sentences are offer surprisingly good customer service. He says, customers are used to being maltreated. Most of the companies they deal with are quasi-monopolies, and they get away with atrocious customer service. Your own ideas about what's possible have been unconsciously lowered by such experiences. Try making your customer service not merely good, but surprisingly good. Go out of your way to make people really happy. They'll be overwhelmed. You'll see. In the earliest stages of a startup, it pays to offer customer service on a level that wouldn't scale, because it's a way of learning about your users.
Yeah, I really love this one. Although I would actually say that in a very subtle way, Paul contradicts himself a little bit within the statement, right? Because he's talking about why big companies offer bad customer service because they're quasi-monopolies. But then he admits later on it's because quite often incredible customer service doesn't scale very well. And so when you're an early stage startup, you want to be looking for things that actually advantage you by not having scale. So many things are against you because you're not at scale, right? You don't have the resources, you don't have the money, you don't have the user base, you don't have the brand, you don't. What do you have? You have the ability to do things that don't scale, and great customer service is one of them. And in fact, a lot of the time what you should be doing as a founder is thinking about, I, the founder, should be providing that customer service for as long as possible. And because I've had this experience, when the founder of a startup emails me directly to give me feedback, replies to my emails, whatever it is, it's a surprise. It's a bit of a shock, a good shock, where I'm like, wow, the founder is actually writing to me. They really care about their product. They really understand the product. They're listening to me. I'm going to forgive a lot because of that. And this customer service, as PG says, it builds a huge amount of loyalty, and it's something that no big company can replicate. Not just quasi-monopolies, but no big company. You simply cannot scale that level of exceptional customer service. So own your advantage of doing something that no big company can do, and don't fail to take that win.
So actually, Yaniv, I want to quibble with this slightly, and I want to quibble with Paul Graham slightly. So what I would say is, with a Silicon Valley style software powered startup, the entire point is to blow people's expectations away. The point of a startup is actually to disrupt mediocre. With user-centricity and with software, to make things so much better because you're rethinking them from first principles, that not only is your customer service going to blow them away, the actual product, the utility, the experience of signing up to the neobank or signing up to ChatGPT or to using whatever, ad network is going to be so much better because this company is thinking about it from first principles and with software and with user centrality in mind, whereas most companies are those disgusting monopolies, right? Now, the second thing I want to say is, this is another example of counterintuitiveness, which is when you grow up in these bigger companies, you assume everybody wants to deal with big companies. We start to use the royal we, like we at Acme Corp do blah, blah, blah. And we don't want anyone to realize that it's just two guys in a garage, right? And so we do all these tricks to try to appear bigger and puff out our chests. Startups are the opposite. We want to know what your journey is. We want to know who's behind it. We want to know you're engaged. We want to know you're fighting and you're scrapping and you're getting shit done. It's not about the royal we. And then finally, this idea of do the customer support that doesn't scale. This leads into another Paul Graham idea that is often misunderstood. And I think, Yaniv, we're going to have a whole episode about this, which is do things that don't scale. And most people take this advice in completely the wrong way. They think, well, Chris, I'm doing a consulting business for now because Paul Graham said it's okay to do things that don't scale. And what people don't realize is he's saying, do customer service that doesn't scale to power your product that does scale. Or like Airbnb, which is the quintessential example, go take photos for your early listings, which doesn't scale, sending photographers out to take the photos. But the marketplace, the Airbnb marketplace, does scale. So you've got to do things that don't scale to bootstrap your scalable product, your scalable marketplace, your scalable business. And so it's not do anything that doesn't scale. It's do things that don't scale to bootstrap your scalable product in your business. That's very, very important.
Yeah. There's another reason, though, to do these things that don't scale, especially customer service, Chris, is that it's another way of doing customer discovery. If what was the previous one? Get to know your customers really, really well, right? Well, this is one of the ways you do it, is you do incredible support and you do as much of it yourself.
But just the other gotcha here is that people without product craft, they don't have the benefit of having Paul Graham, co-author their startup with them in Y Combinator, is they will do that and then they'll go down this rabbit hole of overbuilding something for one customer. So that requires craft and taste and judgment about listening, learning, but not over-indexing on one customer. It's a real art.
Looking for a tech partner to scale your business? Here's one I can personally endorse, Warp Development. With 22 years of experience and 100 plus experts, they deliver custom software and AI solutions that drive results. Visit warpdevelopment.com and mention the Startup Podcast for a free consultation. All the best .coms are taken or crazily overpriced, so you settle on a workaround domain for your website. Don't compromise. Get a clean, sharp .tech domain that instantly says, this is a tech startup. Grab yours at get.tech/TSP for the Startup Podcast or via domain registrars like GoDaddy. Okay, number 7. We are past halfway. You make what you measure. Merely measuring something has an uncanny tendency to improve it. If you want to make your user numbers go up, put a big piece of paper on your wall and every day plot the number of users. You'll be delighted when it goes up and disappointed when it goes down. Pretty soon, you'll start noticing what makes the number go up and you'll start to do more of that. Corollary, be careful what you measure.
This is why revenue is so dangerous, right, Yaniv? If you're measuring revenue, then the fastest way to make revenue go up is to sell big enterprise deals to big logos, to basically do bespoke deployments of their big, heavy-duty software and super serve all their needs. The number go up, revenue go up, break even is in sight. Fantastic. But it doesn't scale. So what you need to be measuring is actually active users, cost of acquisition, lifetime value, retention, and the cost of revenue and how well your startup will scale. The trick here is that, in the earlier bullets, it was do things that don't scale, go dig deep and super serve a customer, but do it. Here's the trick that nobody ever says. Do it for free. If you start charging the customer for all of this consulting and non-recurring engineering, they now become your customer instead of your guinea pig. And you don't ever get out of that addiction to that revenue. So measure what matters. What matters is something that scales. And so make sure you're measuring scalable metrics. Now, at some point, your revenue, your lifetime value, your return on investment, those things are going to be the things that you're trying to scale because you've solved for some of the other metrics, but just be careful about timing.
So I've got very mixed feelings about this one, Chris, because that very last bit that Paul referenced, right? Be careful what you measure. That makes me think of my favorite law, Goodhart's law, which states when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure, right? And this is all about KPIs, right? When you make something a KPI, then people will do anything they can to make that number go up, including things that are not actually such a great thing to do, right? And so, why do you want the number of users to go up, right? Because the number of users is a proxy of how much usage your product is getting, right? But if you measure the number of users, then you might do things like change how people interact with the product so you get to count them as a user, right? You say, I remember this back in my Google Plus days, back at Google, where they wanted to say they had as many active users as possible. So they put Google Plus into all sorts of places where it didn't belong. For example, notifications. And then when someone dismissed the notification, they were like, well, that counts as an interaction with Google Plus. That will count as one of our active users, right? So you have to be so careful here, right? Remember, what Goodhart's law is saying is the thing that you're measuring is not actually the thing that you care about, except in very rare instances. It's a proxy for the thing that you care about. And if you focus too much on making that number go up, the link between the thing you're measuring and the underlying proxy that you care about, that correlation will dissipate. So yes, measure things. Yes, make sure that you are measuring the things that matter and try to make them go up, but don't try too hard, right? You really have to have this kind of sense of like, Let's go back to first principles. Let's go back to what are we actually trying to do? What are the things that matter to us? And understanding that those measures are imperfect proxies of those things.
Yeah, I've told this story on the pod before, but I'm always reminded of this incident at Uber where I was doing a business review with a bunch of people who were fairly antagonistic to what we were doing, and they kept on trying to remind me that the number isn't moving. The number isn't moving. We need to drive first trips. I was trying to explain in very thoughtful, careful ways about how I thought the developer platform was not really the primary tool to drive first trips, and there were other better metrics or better things that we could be doing. And they just kept on coming back to the number and the number and the number. But Chris, the OKR is this, and then the number is this. And I finally blurted out, I don't give a shit about the numbers.
And that's why you no longer work at Uber.
And that's why I no longer work at Uber. It's just like there was just a chill in the whole room. Like at Uber, to say you don't care about the data, you don't care about the numbers, it was like, holy shit. And it was like, you guys are not thinking from first principles, although they all claim to be. This number is the wrong number. I don't care who signed up for this OKR. I don't care that you like this OKR. I'm in founder mode. I'm not here to preserve the OKR. I'm here to move the needle for the business. And so, yeah, you've got to be principled. You've got to have a team of principled people knowing when the number doesn't matter and switching gears. Number 8 on Paul Graham's 13 sentences that describe startups. He says, spend little. I can't emphasize enough, he writes, how important it is for a startup to be cheap. Most startups fail before they make something people want, and the most common form of failure is running out of money. So being cheap is almost interchangeable with iterating rapidly. But it's more than that. A culture of cheapness keeps companies young in something like the same way exercise keeps people young. So he's saying staying cheap keeps you young, keeps you nimble, keeps you agile, and allows you to have more runway to run those experiments and to learn and iterate.
Yeah. Is this me disagreeing with Paul Graham again? So I wrote a LinkedIn post not that long ago where I said, be frugal, but don't be cheap, right? What is the difference, right? Cheap means you don't spend money when spending money would provide you a great benefit, where you're simply optimizing for spending as little money as possible. Going back to my previous point, if your KPI is spending as little money as possible, you're going to focus on the not spending the money rather than what it's a proxy for, which is what PG is actually saying. So I don't really disagree with him, is that if you make sure that every dollar goes to its best use, you are extending your runway, you get more shots on goal, you get more opportunities to iterate, and that's really valuable. That's frugality. Make sure that every dollar is spent meaningfully. But the aim here is not simply to spend as little money as possible.
Yeah, the word here I'd use is efficiency, efficient capital expenditure. You want to be efficient. For every dollar you spend, you want maximum return. And sometimes you have to spend a lot of dollars to get, incredible rock stars who would move the needle for you, to buy ads, to move mountains, to buy a piece of software that would cost you more time, money, or effort to build yourself. Yes, frugality tends to have a negative connotation with it. So I like the word efficiency, capital efficiency. But we're both saying the same thing, Yaniv, which is spend wisely, get results, move fast.
Okay, let's go up to number 9. Get Ramen profitable. Ramen profitable means a startup makes just enough to pay the founder's living expenses. It's not rapid prototyping for business models, though it can be, but more a way of hacking the investment process. Once you cross into Ramen profitable, it completely changes your relationship with investors. It's also great for morale.
Yeah, I think this is really right for especially early stage startups where they can be really scrappy and they can, learn and iterate with just a couple of founders, and they haven't started to scale up. They don't need customer support and they don't need this other stuff. Once you get a little bigger, you're going to need to invest ahead of the curve, right? That's what VC is for. But in theory, you should be in a position where you could shed some stuff and the thing keeps running if you absolutely need to. But yeah, it's amazing how your relationship to investors changes when you don't need them. Yaniv, you and I were talking about, before we started recording, this idea of telling investors they're wrong and being willing to get up and say, I'm sorry, this isn't a fit. And it's really, really hard when you really need their money. And if you technically don't, you're obviously very much in a better position. But I really want to caution on this one, because VC and is all about investing ahead of the curve. It's investing ahead of profitability, ahead of break even. And so it's another one where the devil is in the details. The timing really matters, and and getting this right is not obvious unless you're in Y Combinator.
Yeah, I would sort of rephrase this one, Chris, because I would also say that this is the sort of one that it applies, you said to early stage founders, I would say it particularly applies to young founders who don't have a lot of obligations in life. They don't have a spouse, they don't have children and so on, right? Are you going to feed your 3-year-old ramen every day? The hell you are, right? And so the way I would phrase this one is, you nailed it, Chris. What is the value of ramen profitability? And as PG said, it completely changes your relationship with investors. Why? Because you can walk away. So what I would say is get yourself into position where you can walk away from investors. And I think, depending on where you're at in life, there are different ways to do that, right? When you're very young, you probably don't have a lot of money, but you have time and you have a lack of obligations and burdens. And so ramen profitability, the idea of living extremely cheaply and bringing in just enough revenue to cover your personal expenses, that makes sense. When you're a bit older, perhaps what you need to be thinking about is, if you want to be a founder, and this is maybe a bit of tough love, because not every person who's older is in this position, but it's better to say maybe you've actually made some personal savings, right? You've been around for a while, you've been able to save some money, and your ability to walk away from investors is your ability to self-fund, right? So you're not cutting yourself down to ramen profitability, but you say, you know what? I've got 12 months, 18 months of personal runway that I'm able to put into this thing. So if other people won't invest in my business, well, I will. Are there downsides to that? Yes. But in the same way as ramen profitability does, it gives you that ability to walk away from investors. And that ability, first of all, it stops you from making bad decisions, Chris, from taking money from investors who are not a fit. But more to the point, anybody who negotiates for a living, and a lot of people who don't also know, the most powerful negotiation position is to have a genuine willingness to walk away. You will be more likely to raise if you're not desperate, right? And so whatever stage of life you're at, figure out a way to make yourself not desperate. That is the underlying truth behind what Paul Graham is saying in this one.
Yeah, and this all reminds me of something that's slightly aside, which is, I think one of the harshest criticisms you could make about Y Combinator is that it is a little bit of a production line, leveraging a lot of young kids, young, dumb founders who are willing to hustle hard and, live very frugally to go, hustle to make Paul Graham and Y Combinator a lot of money. I don't think that's a entirely fair characterization. I think they're giving a lot of young people a lot of opportunities and helping them become millionaires in some cases. But it is a bit of a production line and a bit of a grind. And the other thing it brings to mind is when you're young, your advantage is you have lower cost of living, you have lower obligations, you can have a lot of energy, you can hustle. When you're older, you trade that for maybe more focus, more experience, a deeper network, and so on. And so you have to play to your strength, as you're pointing to, Yaniv. And this point from Paul Graham sort of belies the Y Combinator strategy here, which is get young people who can survive on ramen for a long time.
But yes, your forms of capital change as you get older, and use those forms of capital to not be totally beholden to investors. That is the underlying message that I take away from it, Chris.
His next sentence here, number 10, is avoid distractions. He writes, nothing kills startups like distractions. The worst type are those that pay money, day jobs, consulting, profitable side projects.
Isn't that lucky, Chris? Isn't it lucky that this podcast is not profitable?
It's true, yes. The startup may have more long-term potential, but you'll always interrupt working on it to answer calls from people paying you now. Paradoxically, fundraising is this type of distraction too, so try to minimize it as well. Oh boy, The thing is, he's talking about external distractions, which so many founders are out there building community, contributing to the startup ecosystem, running events, like participating on LinkedIn. I'm not looking at you, doing all of this stuff that's external to the startup. But I find equally bad and less well understood is all the distractions that are inside the startup, all the hedging, all the optionality, all the chasing the two rabbits, all of the 17 different focus areas, and of course, those vaunted customers who pay you a lot of money but are actually taking you down a rabbit hole. So yeah, distractions. Oh my God. We talk about this in the context of focus, right, Yaniv? Over and over and over again. Focus, focus, focus.
I think you're right, Chris, to add to what Paul Graham here said. It's not just external distractions, it's all sorts of distractions. To be able to do what you're trying to do with a startup, which is to exquisitely understand your users' problems, to iterate rapidly on a solution and then to scale up that solution. In the meantime, to do things that don't scale, so you have the right to scale that up, that requires a great degree of focus. And there are so many things in the world, in society, again, in our human nature, that push against that focus. And so part of, I think there's sometimes this concept of lifestyle design, right? Where you say, if I want to be less distracted, I create an environment where there are fewer distractions. And I think that is what he's saying here, right? If you want to do your startup really well, make sure that there aren't that many things distracting you from it, because you will be tested, because your focus will be tested. And the only way through is to have sufficient focus for a sufficiently long time to actually build that product that solves a real problem for a lot of people, and then you're on your way to scaling it.
All right, Yaniv, let's do the last three together because they're really roughly associated to each other. The first is don't get demoralized. The second is if you get demoralized, don't give up. And then the last one is deals fall through, which might be the cause of you being demoralized or wanting to give up. But essentially, it's keep going, right? Run through those brick walls and keep powering through, because you never know when you're going to have a breakthrough. And it takes that kind of grit and resilience to really make startups succeed.
I mean, you say run through those brick walls. I kind of feel like it's more like hang in there for dear life, right? Like there's this concept of a startup as being an emotional roller coaster, which is very true. Like on any given day, you feel on top of the world and you feel like an absolute piece of shit on the same day. And then you do that day after day after day, right? And so it is so easy to get sick of those points where you feel like crap, right? You get demoralized. Those things get to you. Human loss aversion means you take the losses more intensely than you take the wins, right? And you take too many of those losses and then potentially you give up, right? And what is one of the biggest causes? I'm raising money at the moment. The amount of rejection you get, the number of deals that fall through, right? When you're raising, when you are working with partners, another topic that we talk about a lot here. Do not count your chickens before they hatch. And remember that deals falling through is not a judgment on you as a person. And even if it is a judgment on your startup in some sense, it doesn't mean that the people who are rejecting you are good judges of your startup. So keep your chin up, hang in there for dear life, and remember why you're doing what you're doing. If you need more than just 13 sentences of slightly dated advice from Paul Graham, you want someone who can really jump into your startup and give you that nuanced guidance on your way through that roller coaster. That's what you love to do. Chris, how can people work with you?
Yeah, you can learn more about what I do over at chrissaad.com/advisory, or follow my newsletter at chrissaad.com/newsletter, or all good social media sites, which excludes Twitter. How about you, Yaniv?
I'm on LinkedIn trying to make it a less boring place. I love getting connection requests from TSP listeners, so let me know that's where you come from and I will accept your request. I am also raising a pre-seed round for my own startup, Violet, which makes this podcast even better because I am living all of this every day, Chris. Folks, if you are angel investors and perhaps interested in learning a little bit more about what we do, feel free to DM me and we can have a chat. All right, that was a fun one as always, Chris. Have a good one.
All right, catch you in the next one. Bye-bye.
This episode of the Startup Podcast was brought to you by Warp Development. I know a lot of you rely on dev agencies to help build your product. Problem is, a lot of these agencies suck. Ask me how I know. I've been looking for one that I can really endorse, and I have finally found one. Warp Development are the powerhouse behind countless successful startups and enterprises for over 22 years. They have over 100 experts who don't just code, they solve business problems alongside you. From custom software to AI consulting, Warp Development delivers results that move your business forward. And they're in your time zone. They have offices in Australia, the United States, and South Africa, so you get local support with global expertise. Are you ready to build something that matters? Visit warpdevelopment.com, that's WARP development.com, and mention the Startup Podcast for a free consultation. Today's episode of the Startup Podcast was brought to you by .tech domains. Naming your startup should be easy, but it isn't because all the good .com names are taken or wildly overpriced. No more. You don't have to compromise. Your domain shows your focus and intent, so make it sharp, clean, and unmistakably tech with a .tech domain. How do you do that? Head to www.get.tech/TSP or a registrar like GoDaddy and grab your .tech domain today. Get.tech/TSP for the Startup Podcast so they know you came from us.